The four intentionalities are, firstly, consciousness of the real. Secondly, consciousness of the ideal. Thirdly, consciousness of the constituted world. And fourthly, consciousness of the exclusion from being. This is not a classification of intentionally directed acts of consciousness. Is it a classification of the objects of such acts? Not initially, if at all. These intentionalities are at first to guide us through an examination of the problems pertaining to phenomenological metaphysics. The metaphysical triad of phenomenology was, in principle, a historically oriented dialectic which helped us to circumscribe the problems to be considered in the metaphysics that we seek to develop. Now these problems must be clarified in more detail. Though still historically informed, still in a historically informed way. It is the second phase of a dialectical preparation for phenomenological metaphysics. Here I make a note that when we speak of dialectics here, we mean this in the sense that Aristotle speaks of it in his Topics. It is, if you will, a kind of conversation among great minds, taking into account widely received opinions. At this stage of inquiry, rigorous demonstrations are not forthcoming. It goes without saying that we do not mean dialectic in the sense of Hegel or Marx. Okay, for them, dialectics is a metaphysics. Totally different story. So let us now enter into elaborations of the first intentionality, consciousness of the real. This intentionality has a privileged status among uh, among the four intentionalities for two reasons. People are, for the most part, extremely confident that they know the real, whereas the other objects of consciousness seem more nebulous, weird, abstract, metaphysical, uh, in a very crude, metaphysical in a very crude, though very widespread sense. Uh, the second reason why the first intentionality is privileged is this. In our consideration of the first intentionality, we are to examine whether consciousness itself is real, and if so, in what manner it is real. So the all of a phenomenological metaphysics really turns on this. It seems obvious that consciousness is real and is intentionally directed. And yet, certain philosophers have argued that consciousness is not real and doesn't exist at all. Here I am not talking about the hardcore materialists um, who are very remote from phenomenology in their concerns, but rather I have in mind the phenomenalists, not phenomenologists, phenomenalists, uh, who are to be found among such great minds, great thinkers as Ernst Mach in his analysis of sensations, William James in his essays in radical empiricism, and Bertrand Russell in his analysis of mind. The view is also known as neutral monism, and of course, as suggested by James, radical empiricism. In its early days, it was often called empirio-criticism, uh, criticized by Lenin, the famous Russian revolutionary, uh, good old Vladimir, uh, who was a Marxist materialist. Um, we have we have seen in the discussion of the metaphysical triad of phenomenology that Alexios Minon puts great weight on the distinction between a color and the seeing of a color. The phenomenalists will say that these are not all these are not uh, two distinct items. So the color and the seeing of the color, according to the phenomenalists, are not distinct items. We, of course, uh, theoretically construct an entity that sees the color. That's what the phenomenalists say. We construct it. But this entity, supposedly a mental entity, is just a fiction that may or may not be useful for various purposes, for example, social ones. But if we wish to adhere to what is absolutely given, we should only speak of colors, sounds, and the like. As the mental thing and the mental act are fictions, so is the physical one. Strictly speaking, according to phenomenalism. Of course, Mach was himself a physicist. We measure the speed of sound by means of units which are named after him, Mach 1, Mach 2, and so forth. He thinks that the construction of the physical from the original data, the elements in his terminology, um, is a scientifically legitimate endeavor. There's nothing wrong with constructing these fictions. Uh, according to him, it's all about thought economy. If it economizes our thought, makes it easier, simpler to deal with the data um, by constructing these fictions, then it's fine. But it is a theoretical construction nonetheless, devoid of all metaphysical import. The same goes for a mental entity, a soul, a self, or whatever the metaphysician may care to call it. Psychology may engage in construction along with physiology, but a metaphysics of the self is to be absolutely banished from science. The same goes for a metaphysics of uh, consciousness, as Brentano and his students were attempting to develop this. Of course, we are familiar with the neo positivism that came to be cultivated in the Vienna Circle under the leadership of Moritz Schlick. This group was in fact called the Ernst Mach Society. Initially, it was called that, and was indeed anti metaphysical, as Mach himself declared his doctrine of elements to be. Phenomenalism was in fact regarded as a legitimate view in neo positivism. Here we should be very clear in stating that phenomenalism is no less a metaphysical position than the view uh, that physical things uh, or mental things exist. Phenomenalism tells us that being includes only phenomenal elements and all else does not exist. Hence, Mach and the neo positivists were advocating their own peculiar metaphysics. Nevertheless, we can still consider whether the phenomenalistic metaphysics is correct and thereby destroys the concept of intentionality and delegitimizes phenomenological metaphysics, not to mention phenomenology itself. The weak point in phenomenalism uh, seems to be a failure to account for such acts of consciousness as memory and expectation. So if I remember, there's an act occurring in my consciousness now. Remembering is an act of consciousness, but the remembered object is past. They can't be identical, right? Same with expectations. If I'm expecting something now, what I am expecting lies in the future or would be lying in the future if the expectation were correct. That's not really an issue. Uh, so how can you account for this if you obliterate intentionality? It is more difficult, however, to deal with phenomenalism on the issue of sensation. Here we are only examining the problems to be dealt with in uh, in uh, phenomenalism. So we're not really we're dealing with the problem that phenomenalism poses. We're not giving some kind of definitive refutation of it. Dealing with them, well, expounding upon them. Uh, it's really premature to offer definitive solutions, but we should actually strive towards them. Uh, we shall postpone a closer consideration of this till a later stage of the investigation, especially the consideration of consciousness of the exclusion from being. That's where we will have to come to grips with this phenomenalistic view of sensations. It seems highly plausible at this juncture, however, that we have a right to use the concept of intentionality. Yet we are left with the problem concerning the entity uh, to which we must ascribe intentionality. Is this a mental thing, a self, a soul, an ego, or whatnot, or an act of consciousness, or is it both? We have seen that Franz Brentano, in his mature metaphysics, claimed that there are only things. He accordingly seems to have no choice but to say that only mental things are intentionally directed at objects. When we are speaking of acts of consciousness, we are using linguistic fictions. There is no remembering act, strictly speaking, but there is rather a remembering soul that is intentionally directed to a past object. It is interesting to note that Husserl went through a phase where he maintained that all talk of a mental entity is reducible to a bundle of acts of consciousness. Actually, acts plus other ingredients in consciousness which are not themselves acts. So Husserl has a rather qualified view of intentionality, um, but that need not trouble us here. So he takes this notion of a bundle, of course, from David Hume, but for David Hume, I am a bundle of ideas and impressions. So Husserl modifies that, updates it, so to speak, uh, to encompass acts. So I am a bundle of acts that are all, they all cohere together in some kind of unity. Actually, Brentano also put forth this idea that we can develop a kind of phenomenology without positing a self, a soul, or an ego. Early Brentano, um, but that was just a preliminary uh, view on his part. That was not, even in his early days, that was not his full-fledged theory. That was more to accommodate his contemporaries, as I interpret him. Um, So, as regards Husserl, he put forth this view of a bundle, that consciousness, intentionally directed consciousness, is a bundle of acts, not some kind of self that they're all attributed to. He put this forth in the first edition of his logical investigations. So that's in the second volume, which so around 1901. Although he restricted it in the second, well, he retracted it. Okay, he retracted that view in the second edition of that work, and he says that since that time, since that early time, he has learned to find the ego. A very curious passage. Perhaps Husserl retracted it due to the influence of Theodor Lipps and his students in Munich, um, especially Alexander Fender, because these guys definitely thought that there was a self. Lipps was known for saying in his lectures, uh, Ich fühle mich, which is good German, but he contrasts that also with good German, but it he makes a philosophical point. Ich empfinde etwas. So, ich fühle mich, ich empfinde etwas. Um, so I have a sensory experience of something. I feel myself. So Lipps, Fender, and these Munich phenomenologists uh, tied their theory of the self together with a theory of feelings. In the feelings, we're actually more in touch with ourselves than we are in our sensations and other acts of consciousness. Now, of course, yes, okay, well, Husserl might have been influenced by them, but, you know, uh, within a few years, definitely by 1913, when he said he retracted, he retracted that early theory of a bundle. In 1913, he published his ideas pertaining to a pure phenomenology and a phenomenological philosophy, where, of course, the ego is plainly given its rights, and also in the second edition of the logical investigations. There's a twist, however. He says that the ego is not real. The one that we find through the phenomenological reduction, the transcendental ego, as he often calls it, it's not real. Um, it's irreal. The things that we perceive are real, but they only have a kind of relative existence. This pure ego, this transcendental ego, has an absolute existence. I already criticized this view somewhat in my examination of the metaphysical triad of being, but we have to still postpone that. It's really too early to give a definitive pronouncement on the view. Uh, so I think these here I've tried to lay out a little bit the kinds of problems that some of the problems we have to deal with in the first intentionality. But I want to do a little more on that topic. So I think I'll return to the subject and elaborate a bit on problems from ancient and medieval philosophy. Um, and I think I'll connect with Thomas Aquinas particularly on that point. Uh, and then after that, I think we'll have some sense of what you have to deal with in developing a theory, a metaphysical theory of the consciousness of the real. And then after that, I want to deal with the consciousness of the ideal, then with the consciousness of the constituted world, and finally with the consciousness of the exclusion from being. Um, but this is all in the aporetic phase of investigation. Uh, so they, we can't be offering any actual demonstration here. It's dialectic in the sense that I have indicated. Um, so I think I'll leave it there for the time being. Um, thank you all for listening. Um, I thank Joseph Petrick, who was one of my very first philosophical mentors, and he actually got me interested in all this stuff. Uh, and well, I'll probably think of more people to thank as I go along. But so the next thing coming will be the second part of my operatic uh, consideration of the first intentionality. Thank you for listening. Bye.